Hi, welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, collector, bookseller, all that stuff. And today I thought we'd take a look at a little series which are the precursors of the Masterworks. And some of these, I think most of them I've shown in sort of various bits of videos that we've done over the years, but I thought it was time to look at them collectively. There were only ever 20 of them. I don't have them all. As I always say, I'm not a completist. Though I will say that if you could come across them in really good condition, which you never do with this series, they're always in a state, is what I found, I would probably pick up the others and go for completism because they bring back a lot of memories. And there are some I used to have which tragically I got rid of. So just to put some history into this. Gollancz, of course, is a publisher which goes back a long way. They were founded back in 1927 by Mr. Victor Gollancz himself, and he died in the late 60s and his daughter Livia took over. And Gollancz were just a general mainstream sort of publisher, really. They did all sorts of things, fiction, non-fiction, and Victor Gollancz was very active on the left in politics. He published people like George Orwell. They published loads and loads of crime fiction. They did their first sort of SF back in the 50s, but they didn't get really into it until the early 60s with the distinctive Gollancz yellow jackets, which I love, what you've seen on this channel. And one day I'm going to do a video about all of them, which I know some of you will hate, but some of you will love. I love them, I don't care. But Gollancz didn't do any paperbacks until 1986, and these are the first paperbacks they ever published. Like many literary publishers in the UK then and in the States, what they would do is license the rights to print the books in paperback out to paperback publishers. So for many decades, Gollancz were building up this amazing backlist of SF, which they published in hardcover, mostly in plain jackets, very few were pictorial. There was the odd one, then they started to do all of them, or most of them pictorially, from the late 80s on, because of course, before that, they'd done a lot of business with libraries in the UK. And the 80s was the time when libraries really started to sort of go down in the UK. And that coincided with bookshops on the up, with there being big bookshops right across the UK for the first time. So there was a lot going on. So Gollancz decided to look into their backlist, reclaim the paperback rights from the publishers who'd done these books, and start their own classic SF line. Now, these are B format books, and that was unusual at that time to have SF in B format. Here's an A format book from Gollancz a year or two later. Show you the size difference. There you go. So as you see, smaller. So that's the difference between A and B. I've talked about this on the channel many times. There is a video about common book formats. You can look it up. If you go into the search field on the Outlaw Bookseller channel, common book formats, it'll pop up. So as I say, in 86, they decided to start doing their own editions of classic books, and many of them had been unavailable for some time. And to start the series off, this was in, let me see, March 1986. And I remember this really well because I was running a small bookshop for Pan, and Pan had dropped the Pan lozenge by that point. And that was my first manager's job. It wasn't my first bookshop sort of in management job. I'd been assistant manager in another shop, but this was the first time I managed a bookshop for Pan. And they're a great company. And when our relationship came to an end, they asked me to come and work for them in Basingstoke. And a lot of publishing reps said to me a couple of years later, you should have taken that job. You would have been editor of Pan SF in no time. And of course, I'd have revived the lozenge if I could have. But, you know, I was young, I was in love, I was enjoying being in Bath. I was enjoying my book selling career, and I wasn't very career oriented then. It was just one of those things. I fell into roles, and only later I became more ambitious. But these were exciting because, I say, the first Gollancz paperbacks, they were B format, and as you say, they're very beautiful indeed. So the Sirens of Titan, these are numbered. You'll see on the spine they're numbered. There's number 1, the Sirens of Titan. And this had been out to print in the UK for years and years and years. Most of these have been out to print for 10 years or more. And they tended to have a generic blurb on the back cover, a quotation from Arthur C. Clarke, and a quotation from Doris Lessing, who talked about how much she loved science fiction. And then usually they'd restrict themselves to a few quotations from reviews. So you didn't get a huge amount of blurb. There's a bit of a blurb inside the jacket there, and you'd get that. But these really were sold on the fact that they were incredibly beautiful. They looked like science fiction books because they had excellent SF art, but at the same time, they resembled the literary B format imprints, which were riding high in the 1980s. Picador, Paladin had just started doing fiction for the first time. They'd only ever done non-fiction in paperback. Abacus, Flamingo, all those things. So as I say, they did 4 to launch, and these are numbers 1, 3 and 4. Number 2 was More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon, which I used to have and I got rid of because I never really got on with it. I never really got on with Sturgeon. And I still have issues with him now. There's a video on the channel called Salty Undisciplined Fish Eggs. Is Theodore Sturgeon overrated? And I reread More Than Human a few years ago and I enjoyed it a lot more, but I still find him incredibly uneven. It's strange really, because a lot of the great early genre SF writers were uneven. Philip K. Dick's uneven. But there was a real unevenness about Sturgeon, which I think prevented me from enjoying his work, say, as much as I did that of Ray Bradbury or John Wyndham. You just felt that now and again he lost control. And even though there's moments of absolute brilliance, I still remain divided within about his work. Nevertheless, looking at the Science of Titan obviously is a massively important book. Vonnegut's second novel and his second SF novel. And if you've never read it, it's obviously something which came out around about the time that Robert Sheckley was first writing as well. I wonder whether Vonnegut ever read Sheckley. To me, there's a lot of similarities. And it's also hugely influential of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You can really see it. It really is there. And Vonnegut I blow hot and cold about. When I'm in the mood, I love him. When I'm not, I don't so much. I've read this twice. The first time I read it was in this edition. Or was it? I don't think it was. No, it wasn't. I had an A format, which I bought from Forever People in Bristol about 2 years before. And that was the one I read. And I got rid of it when this came out because this was so beautiful. And I've read it once since then, and I really didn't get on with it. But like I say, that's me and Vonnegut. We've got a difficult relationship. The Silverberg, I reviewed this in some more depth in the club room a little while ago when I launched the club room. The membership is still only $4.99 a month for a special exclusive video every week. And that absolutely blew me away. It's an amazing book, and I consider it to be one of his 4 best books, alongside The Book of Skulls, Dying Inside, and Downward to the Earth, and a 5th, I would say, Man in the Maze. That's not any ranked order, I can't decide, but this had a really, really massive impact on me. So if you want to see the review of that, that's in the club room. And it nearly got into 100 must-read science fiction novels, and it got left up for some reason I can't recall. And I based my review on the text I wrote at the time, which I still have. I still have some sort of drafts which were never finished or never used, which was interesting. I only came across them the other day. I forgot I had them. And then, of course, Nova, the space opera to end all space operas, had been out of print for a few years. I read it first in this edition. By this point, I'd already read a few Delaney's. I'd read Jewels of Aptor, the Towers books, which I haven't read since, and I really need to go back to. And also, I had a little B format, not little B format, a A format. I think it's a Ballantine. I'm not sure. I've got it here somewhere. Omnibus of Babel 17 and the Einstein intersection, which at that time was called A Fabulous Formless Darkness. It also contained the stories Time Considered as a Helix of Semi-Precious Stones and the very wonderful I and Gomorrah, which is one of my favourite pieces of fiction of all time. And that book's called The Complete Nebula Award winning fiction. Now, Nova didn't win the Nebula Award, so it wasn't included. So this is my first reading. But as you see, absolutely gorgeous. So the second tranche of books in the series was published in September 1986, and they did another 4. So the first 2 tranches were 4 at a time, and then they went down to 2 at a time, and they were usually a few months apart. And I am missing number 5, which is The City and the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke, which I have other editions of, and I never read it at the time. And even though I loved Clarke's 2001 when I was a kid, I've always really struggled with a lot of his other stuff. Even though I do collect his work now, I find him very, very hard to read. I find him very clunky and dry. and his prose really doesn't work for me. Great ideas, but I never thought much of him as a writer. And for somebody like me who was more turned on by more literary people, more literate people like Wyndham, Ballard, Ellison, these people, it just didn't happen for me. But anyway, here's some others. This is number 6, The Dawn of Summer by Robert A. Heinlein. That is one that I acquired only recently, probably about a year and a half ago, and I've shown it in a book haul on the channel. And this is the only decent or half decent book from this series I've seen in the wild for many, many, many years. And David Pringle's a big fan of this. He loves Dawn of Summer. And I'm going to go back to it because I do blow hot and cold on Heinlein. Some of it I just find unreadable, but this is one of the better ones. Then we have number 8, The Reproductive System by John Sladek. There is a Sladek video coming up. I was going to film it this week, and I've been rereading The Muller-Fokker Effect. And it's made me realise, actually, that in the last couple of years, you'll have seen me acquire in book hauls lots of Sladeks I didn't have. And I've realised that I've got more that I haven't read now than I have read. So I need to do some more reading. And I am divided about him at the moment based on my current reading of Muller-Fokker, which I'll talk about when I do that video. But this, of course, was his first novel. In the States, it was called Mechasm, and there's a Door edition. And I don't know if that was the first. It was Gollancz hardcover in the UK. And at that time, late 60s, Sladek, of course, was living in the UK. You'll have heard anecdotes about him in my first interview with Christopher Priest on the channel, or is it the second one? I think it's in the first one. And Sladek was in the UK, contributing to New Worlds and hanging out with Chris Priest, Thomas M. Dish, Delaney, Moorcock, all those people. And Sladek stayed in the UK for a long time. And I have to say, now, if you came along as a writer now like Sladek in, genre SF, you wouldn't have a career. You really wouldn't. He was really too much out there and odd, and maybe he's of his time, but he sort of fitted perfectly. And his early work does remind me a lot, at its best, of Vonnegut, at its worst of Ron Goulart. But as you see, J.G. Ballard, I love this cover art, isn't it fantastic, said that this was brilliant. And the Sunday Times said, an original novel which will surely become a classic. And it's probably his most reproduced book, funnily enough, his most reprinted book. So the Sladek was number 8. So in between Heinlein as number 6 and Sladek 8, there was Wolfbane by Paul and Kornbluth. And I picked up a copy of that a while ago, not in such good nick as these, and I've got rid of it because I reread it and I thought, why did I get rid of this at the time? And I reread it and I found it very, very clever and full of amazing ideas, but also quite irksome as well. And I think, again, I'm divided about C.M. Kornbluth. I think in a lot of his work with Poe, they really pulled it off, but other times there's a kind of feverish, gleeful idiot energy, which isn't idiotic, it's actually clever, but it's a little bit much for me these days. I find it, the satire is really heavy-handed, and you can imagine Kornbluth being like quite an annoying person if that's his voice coming through. And Pohl's work as well is, there was an awful lot of it. He worked very, very hard. He did a lot of publishing, editing, a lot of writing, so that kind of uneven as well. But this whole vein of satirical SF that comes out of the early 50s, it has its precursors, of course, but it's a really big thing in the early 50s with Pohl and Kornbluth and Sheckley, and you can see how this feeds into people like Sladek. So that one I reread, but it also reminded me a lot of some of the ideas which come up in Blindsight. I really think that Pohl and Kornbluth got there first. There's aliens in it which essentially aren't that conscious, and that was a really interesting precursor thing, I thought. But as you'll see, I'm flashing up pictures of all of these as they go, and I'll bring in the old caveat that I'm not a completist. Some people sort of go out and they buy the lot. I know my friend Jules would want to get the lot, then do the video, and you'd see the whole thing. But I don't work that way. For me, it's very much about just the reading and the books, and I won't go for completism for its own sake. Because when I do that, and I was doing that recently with the MIT series of Radium Age. I always feel shortchanged because they will publish a book which I'm not interested in, or I don't think is any good, or I don't think belongs in a series. And that's the thing. You've got to remember the publishers will publish what they have access to and what they have the rights to, unless they're all books which are out of copyright. So this is interesting, looking at the choices that Gollancz were making. They were going for classic, modern classic things which they felt were important, which had drifted out of print from other publishers. And you really see a really strong editorial hand here in thinking about the history of SF as they release these books from their archives, from their hardcover rights into these paperbacks. So you'll see here a rather nice copy of Wreath of Stars by Bob Shaw, which is one of my favourite Shaws. And my first copy was the pan lozenge, which I still have. I've also upgraded that. But this was a case where I bought this because it's so beautiful and it was one of my favourite Shaws. And I reread it for about, God, the millionth time, probably about the sixth time, but the first time in many years, and did a review of that some time back. And I think it was in response to the fact that my good chum Matt at Bookpill read it, and he wasn't so impressed with it, which I was disappointed by. But there you go. And it's funny with Shaw, he's really come to the fore more in the last few years since some of us have been talking about him. And he was always a favourite of mine, but people have gone really bonkers for The Palace of Eternity, which I enjoyed, but I didn't think it was front rank. I really think this is a great book, and its subtleties, and its elegiac quality are really important. So this is a good one I found. You'll see that there's a little blurb there, and Martin Amis says, brilliant, witty, frightening, and admirably ambitious. And of course, Martin was the son of Kingsley, who wrote the classic non-fiction book about SF way back, New Maps of Hell. And Kingsley himself wrote SF as well, of course. The Alteration, which is wonderful novel of alternate history, which I read, SF Words of Wonder, read recently, actually. Also, he wrote, what else did he write that was SF? There's Russian Hide and Seek, I think, seem to remember. And also, what's the other one? There's the other one as well. And of course, I'm actually thinking of his ghost story, The Green Man, which is superb. And he did write some SF short stories as well. And he was a big fan of SF, did some good SF criticism. And Martin, of course, wrote some SF things as well. And he also wrote the screenplay for Saturn III, that rather cheesy robot film with Farrah Fawcett and Kirk Douglas in his sort of later days, which is a bit of a cult classic these days. So, Martin read lots and lots of SF when he was a kid because his dad would hand it down. So he had really, really good taste. So he understood the writing of people like Shaw and Paul and Cornbluth, and he was well placed to critique SF for reviews. So the Shaw and another missing one, number 9 from the series, Fall of Moondust, came out in February 1987. And by that point, I'd moved on from Pan, and I was working in a great little bookshop, an independent bookshop called Bilbo's, which was a multi-story thing on a corner in Bath, run by a great guy called Pete Marsh, who I saw the other day, first time in some years. And Pete and I did some great fun book selling there. I worked there for a year, and that was probably the last independent I worked in, if I think about it. No, I did do a short stint about 15 years ago in one, but that was good. And to this point, I moved there, and I remember sort of running the SF and the esoteric book sections there. I had some great fun. We wore some good shirts in those days. But Fall of Moondust was the missing one, which came at number 9. And I read Fall of Moondust in a pan lozenge when I was in school. And it's a really, really minor book. And for me, it was the first real fail in this series. It really shouldn't have been in Gollancz Classic SF, but I think it was one that they didn't have licensed out at the time, so they decided to do it. It's basically a kind of straight-ahead disaster novel, really. For me, this was a really important list because not only was I selling them, it was also the first time I'd have the chance to sell them, and in some cases the first time to read them, because a lot of these books were really hard to find, and Rogue Moon used to be really hard to find. It hadn't been in print for quite some time, and I absolutely loved Rogue Moon at the time. I've read it since and I was less keen on it. It seemed a little bit too self-aware of its own hard-boiled nature, and there used to be a lot of talk about how Rogue Moon was a precursor of New Wave SF, and I think there's a certain amount of truth in that, but I'm not really that keen on that as an idea. And I guess it's which new wave are we talking about? Are we talking about the American one? Probably not. We're talking about the British one? Yes, because it does this thing. Well, I'm not going to tell you. You should read it. Budrys had a spotty career. At his best, he was fantastic. And my favourite book by him is a book called Michaelmas, which is a really important book in the development of cyberpunk. And it came out in the mid-70s. And it's about a guy who runs the world without the world realising, with an AI from his briefcase, which he jacks into the telephone system. And Michaelmas, the eponymous character, is like a TV news reporter and journalist. And between them, they manipulate things very, very subtly. And he actually runs the world and stops all sorts of bad things from happening. And that's a great book. That's an important one. And it has a version of the internet in it, which you don't really get much at that point. But Rogue Moon, yeah, a good little read. And Robert Silverberg says on the cover of this, the most terrifying pages in any science fiction novel I've ever read. And this is the one about a strange artifact on the moon, which is very mysterious and nobody knows where it's come from. It's obviously an alien artifact, and people are transmatted there. They go into the artifact. It's like a labyrinth, a maze, and it kills them or it makes them insane. And there's this one guy, and using the sort of transmat thing, they work out a way of resurrecting him, of rebooting him physically. And he goes in time and time again and is killed time and time again as they try and learn about what is going on with this alien artifact. And it is strong stuff, it has to be said. Then Man Plus, which is my favourite Frederick Pohl, absolutely brilliant and a fantastic conceptual breakthrough ending. This is like the dark alternative to The Martian. This is the real thing. I mean, this and Shipwreck by Charles Logan, in terms of, you know, the astronaut on Mars thing, except of course in Shipwreck it isn't Mars, it's another planet. But you know, this is the real thing. It makes the Andy Weir thing look, you know, really sort of soft and floppy. And I love this book. I'm a big fan of it. And again, J.G. Ballard was a massive fan of this as well. On the current Masterworks edition, it just says brilliant J.G. Ballard, and he didn't often give that unqualified praise. Now, a lot of these books, of course, are in current Masterworks. So this was the first try, as it were. And what actually happened was, because these were B format, in the specialist shops in Britain at the time, and I know I've mentioned this before, there were a lot of them: Forbidden Planet, Forever People, Andromeda. You know, they were dotted around Fantasy Centre. You go in these shops, which were dotted around the UK, and their racking was set up for A format books, because most SF was in A format. B was very, very uncommon. This was the UK's first B format SF line. There were science fiction books in B format, like, for example, at this point, Keith Roberts' Pavan was a King Penguin, but King Penguin was not an SF imprint. So a lot of the time, unless you had an eagle-eyed bookseller like me, if you wanted a copy of Pavan, you would find it amongst the general fiction, not amongst the SF. So what happened was that the import shops, the specialists, as they were importing lots of Doors and all sorts of American paperbacks, lots of British A format stuff as well, said to Gollancz, look, we really can't rack these. It's a real problem. Can you shrink them to A? So the series really was almost doomed from the start. But as you see, they just looked amazing. And I think the Mobius strip cover of Inverted World is the best cover it ever had. And was this my first reading of Inverted World? I think it was, because it was really hard to find then. It'd been out of print for a good few years. And what you'll have noticed on YouTube the last few years is that finally people are reading Inverted World. The sort of people who've got channels who, you know, are way, way behind the obvious thing. And a lot of people are reading Inverted World, and it's blowing their minds. And of course, Chris died earlier this year. And anybody who watches the channel knows regularly that I've gone on and on and on about him. And it's nice to see this getting out there, but I think for anybody who loves Inverted World, you know, you should dig into other things. And I think this is the most beautiful edition it had. Also, you'll see, because it's the British edition, it's Inverted World, not The Inverted World. And of course, as I've said before, the original short version of the novel, which appeared in an issue of New Writings in SF, edited by Amy J. Carnell, Ted Carnell, was called The Inverted World. So it would be quite nice at some point, actually, if Gollancz would get the rights to that and would publish the two together in a special edition so people could compare and contrast, because it's very, very interesting. But as I say, absolutely beautiful. And there's a great quotation here from the listener, and it says, "A spinning originality grips every page." And, you know, I think that really sums up what Chris was about. And it won the BSFA award as well. So June 87 was the period in which Inverted World and Flowers for Algernon were published. And then a little bit later, I think it was August, there was this one, the Harlan Ellison Dangerous Visions anthology. This was the only anthology in the series. And we have a missing place here because alongside the Ellison was issued Robert Sheckley's Journey Beyond Tomorrow, aka Journey of Jones. And I don't have I don't know what happened to my copy of that. It went somewhere, and it's a shame, and that's a really uncommon one. And that's a book which is still quite hard to find secondhand in any condition, and yet it pops up in all the reference books. And I have to say, a lot of these books were really influential over me in making a selection for 100 must-read science fiction novels. An awful lot of them were in David Pringle's book, Science Fiction 100 Best Novels, 1948 to 1984. So a lot of these were really epoch-defining books for me in the time when I was reading tons and tons of SF and getting loads of the classics under my belt. And Flowers for Algernon, if you've never read it, is just wonderfully clever book, incredibly moving. And I still cannot get over the fact that it stays in print, but it's never been really big. And one day a celebrity's going to read it, they're going to mention it on Radio 4, or they're going to mention the TV, and all of a sudden everybody's going to discover it. In the States, you know, it's really, really famous. You guys all know it in the States. And it's been, you know, a book used in school for ages and ages. And fittingly, Keyes was an educator, of course, a teacher. Absolute genius, a book about the artificial raising of intelligence and its tragic consequences. Ellison, Dangerous Visions, had been out of print in the UK for some years. It had been a pan lozenge, usually 2 volumes, I seem to recall. And this is a great cover. It's got lots of the Dylan's work on there. And as it says, winner of more awards than any other book in the history of SF. And a quotation by Asimov that says, "The field at its most experimental and daring." Well, I would question that. I like Dangerous Visions. I particularly like all of Ellison's hyperbole in it. I love his introductions, and afterwards, very often they're better than the actual stories. And yeah, there's some amazing stuff in here. Really amazing, you know, Farmers, Riders of the Purple Wage, and I and Gomorrah, all sorts of great stuff in here. But there are some things here which I think are real clunkers. There's a Lester Del Rey story, which, you know, and I'm not very fond of Del Rey. But this was my first exposure to this. And it was an important book, and it's got all the illustrations inside. And, you know, there is still a Dangerous Visions in Gollancz Masterworks now, but no actual Ellison at all, which is a shame, and we all know what's happening with that. But Ellison had sort of burnt his boats with the mainstream publishers by then. He'd never really done anything with Gollancz. I think this is the only Gollancz Ellison ever was. He certainly was never published by them. I don't know why that didn't happen. And, you know, he was so difficult that none of the mainstream publishers would touch him. And also things were gradually moving away from short stories. And as the guy who was in charge at Pan, when they dropped Ellison because of his attitude, said, you know, he's never going to produce that, you know, award-winning best-selling novel that everybody wants him to. And that was absolutely true, sadly. But I think that's the nicest paperback that there ever was of Dangerous Visions, and I really cherish it. So the series gradually grew and drew, I should say, to a close at the end of, let's see, 1987. So it was very short-lived. They'd done 20 books. These are numbers, let's see, so at 18 and 19, Gladiator at Law by Paul and Kornbluth, and Bring the Jubilee by Ward Moore. Gladiator at Law is another book I've reread in recent years. And again, I found Kornbluth's feverish idiot energy a little bit too much for me. That's a phrase that Brian Eno used. idiot energy, and it sort of refers to sort of like when you have very fast music that's very punky, and it's an essential part of rock and roll. And that's one thing that science fiction is like. It's like rock and roll, and that's one of its attractive qualities sometimes. But sometimes it is a bit like an excitable puppy and you want it to calm down. And there is some brilliant stuff in it, but there's this sort of depiction of this strange society where, you know, lawyers are running everything. And they did this. They would take different things, like when Cornbluth wrote The Syndic, societies run like the mafia. You know, they satirize different things in, you know, the Space Machine, not the Space Machine, in the Space Merchants, it's advertising. And, you know, they moved through all these things which were coming to dominate American life and our mass media life in the post-war period. And they understood that really well, and they picked them off one at a time. And they were really good at the satire, but sometimes I find it sort of fractious to read these days, I must admit. Maybe I'm getting beyond that point. I think you find as you get older, you get to a stage where you've read enough of certain things. Like currently, I can't read crime fiction no matter how good it is, because I'm sort of tired of the whole mystery trope. And a lot of the crime fiction I've always loved has always gone beyond that. But even when I read people who are really, really good, like Ross MacDonald, whose prose is amazing, whose characterization is great, whose use of characters coming in seems natural rather than forced just to push the plot on, I just can't do it. I read 2 Japanese crime novels earlier this year, and in their own way they were both great, but I just really had enough of it. And I feel much the same way about horror as well. I've no desire to pick up new horror. I don't quite feel that way about SF yet, so let's hope not. But this is an interesting thing for me, going back to these books and rereading them, because something about the channel is I'm really enjoying seeing a lot of the guys whose channels I really like, who are mostly a good bit younger than me, picking books up and reading them for the first time. And they're things I read decades ago. And one of my great retirement plans was to reread a lot of these things when I retire. But I find that to do them on the channel, I've got to reread them now, because it's with a lot of them, it's been a long time. And sometimes that's a great experience, sometimes a painful one. And generally with Paul and Cornbluth, for me, it's been a painful one, I must say. But don't let me put you off, find out for yourself. Then, the very wonderful Bring the Jubilee by Ward Moore, the classic alternate world story. And I think this book has never had a cover as beautiful as this. It's in print now, it looks fairly dreadful, it's a masterwork again, horrible cover. And this is the What If the South Won the Civil War book. And this is Bradbury-esque and pastoral and gentle. It's a really good characterization. Moore wrote some other things. This is probably his best work. I love the title, Bring the Jubilee. You'll notice how the picture on the cover almost satirizes a combination of Hopper and also Norman Rockwell. You can see the Hopper-esque figure here and the Norman Rockwell type background. And, you know, it's a great, great book, Bring the Jubilee. It should be a lot better known. But as an alternate history, I have one gripe with it. It's got a time machine in it. And any alternate history book which has a time machine in it, I always think is a bit of a cheat. I like the proper counterfactual, where there's a fracture in history, where a moment where something happens or doesn't happen, and it goes off at a tangent, like in Pavan, when Queen Elizabeth is assassinated and the Spanish Armada wins. That's a lot more interesting, and Kingsley Amis does some interesting stuff like that in The Alteration, which is the same basic thing about Catholicism lasting well into the 20th century. Of course, the other big sort of famous Confederacy win book is Guns of the South by Harry Turtledove, but that involves a time machine as well. So in a way, being a bit of a purist, it's not an alternate worlds novel, but it's a great novel either way. So the series wrapped up in December 87 with Bring the Jubilee and Beasts by John Crowley, which is easily my favourite John Crowley book, which I did have in this livery and I no longer have it again. I don't know where it went. I must have sold it on when I got the John Goodchild hardcover. Beasts is a really great book about anthropomorphic animals which have been raised up to human consciousness, and it's very sort of poetic. So there's sort of nods to Cordwainer Smith in there, and yet it's quite different, but it's a lovely book. And again, I'll flash a picture up of that. So Under Pressure from the specialist shops, Gollancz went to start to do their books in a format instead, in the VG-SF imprint, which took over from the classic SF. And it was meant to be a continuation because they picked up the numbering and went with it. So the first one, number 21, I think was Mission of Gravity by Hal Clement. And I don't have any of those books. The numbering went up, I think, until the 40s. And then they started doing their own hardcover books they'd done recently in hardcover. Instead of selling the rights to HarperCollins or whoever, they started doing them as paperbacks themselves, and they brought more backlist in. And this is an oldest from the 60s, and this one they did in late 80s, early 90s. This is number 46, Barefoot in the Head. And of course, VGSF implies very good science fiction, when all it meant was Victor Gollancz. But they were generally fairly ugly books. They had a lot of silver or gold foil on the cover. A lot of books at that period, late 80s, early 90s, were looking pretty unpleasant in terms of the graphics. There's not a great period for SF covers, really, it has to be said. Everybody was trying to look very postmodern, and it didn't always come off. So the beauty of these lovely B formats was lost simply because of the racking in the specialist shops. Do I blame the specialist shops? No, not at all. I wish we still had them. Sadly, we don't. It's a great shame. But those are the ones I've got, so watch out for them. If you see any of them in good condition, pick them up, because like I say, they're really uncommon. And best of luck finding them. And for me, a lot of those books never looked any better, not even in hardcover. So those are the precursors of the Masterworks. That was the first try before the reboot. And I think the reboot, when they started calling them Masterworks, was, I think that was 1999, wasn't it? When they had black spines, which everybody prefers. Nobody seems to like the yellow ones, but I have a fondness for the yellow because, like I say, I remember the original Gollancz Yellow Jackets. So this is Outlaw Bookseller signing out. We'll do another one like this soon, because it's great to sort of look back at these things and to give you some collecting tips. And of all those books, I would say that Bring the Jubilee, Flowers for Algernon, Inverted World, Man Plus, Rogue Moon, Wreath of Stars, Reproductive System, Nova, Time of Changes, they're all essential. In fact, I would say read all of them. They're all worth reading, even the ones I've been slightly disparaging about, like the Paul and Kornbluth. They were great series of books, and it's a shame they ended at 20. Still, such is life.